Greetings from clear and chilly Minnesota. I can tell you for many reasons I'd rather be there with you today. It's warmer, I'm sure. But also just this is a very important issue for me to talk about with other advocates, is that what is it that we do, who are we, why do we do what we do? And being there with you to talk about this would be much more satisfying. For one thing, if I could see you, I would be able to tell who's agreeing with me and who isn't. I'd be able to tell which of you are cynics. The cynics amongst you would be the ones that were saying, yeah, we're all super advocate, but where's the pay? I'd be able to tell which of you did overnights last night and are now taking this in a deep sleep in the third aisle. So there's a lot to be said for actually being there physically in your presence. But instead we have this video kind of operation, and we'll just go with it. And so, as I said, I've been asked to talk about what it is that advocates do and how we do it and why we do it. And I grew up Catholic, so I think of things like advocacy as a vocation. When we were little kids in grade school, the nuns would always say to us, some of you have a calling, a few of you have a vocation. And that meant that we were going to be nuns or priests. So I was always praying for a vocation. I wanted to get a vocation and be called to be a nun. And eventually I did think I was called. I went, when I graduated from high school, I went for my interview to become a nun at the St. Joseph of Carondelet headquarters. And they told me that I was too immature and to come back in a year. And so I thought, well, I better wait till I matured up, and that hasn't happened yet, so I haven't gone back yet. But someday I'm going to go back, and I'm going to be a nun. That's what I'm going to be next. So this notion of a vocation, meaning that we do work that's difficult to do, that's not just about us, that's about others. And the work that we're doing about women who are brutalized in so many ways, we hear these stories over and over and over again, and it takes a toll on us. And we wonder, why do we do it? Why do we do it when it takes a emotional toll on us, a spiritual toll on us? It has so many ways of dragging us down, but at the same time, every time a woman moves from a place of total despair and depression and violence into her own apartment, her own place of freedom, her own new job, then we see this enormous ability of the human spirit to move, to get out of a really bad place and to get somewhere else with that kind of help. And so that's who we are. That's what we do. A while back, my sister and I were having lunch at a restaurant, and my sister does eyewear. She helps people kind of pick the perfect glasses for them, and she runs this eyewear shop. And she said, Ellen, you see that woman over there with the pink blouse on? Don't look. She's over by the door. And she said, her palette doesn't match her glasses. And so I kind of just very casually looked over and thought, oh my God, her palette doesn't match her glasses. I don't even know what her palette is, but apparently it didn't match her glasses. And then I said, Carol, you see the guy over on the left side that's sitting over there reading the newspaper? His wife is with him. And she said, yeah. And I said, he's a wife beater. And after we left lunch and I'm driving back, I thought, what a strange view of the world she has. She looks at how people's palettes fit their glasses, and I look for wife beaters, and I look for women who are being beaten. And after 30 years of this, I walk into a restaurant, and that's what I see, and she walks into a restaurant, and that's what she sees. But it's worth it, and I think everyone sitting in this audience would say it's worth it because of what, in the end, that we've done. In the last 30 years, we have done an incredible thing. We have changed the face of relationships between men and women in marriage. We have, even though it's only advocates that think that violence hasn't been reduced, but there's a significant reduction of wife beating because of the things we've done, because of shelters, because of protection orders, because of men being arrested for doing it, because of men being convicted for doing it. All of these things have led to a significant decrease, not only in wife beating, but the seriousness of the assaults that women are experiencing. The deaths are down. The hospitalizations are down. The number of years that women stay in violent relationships are down because of the work that we do every day. So what is this job that we do called an advocate? How many times have we been asked by a police officer or a prosecutor, well, what do you do? What is your job? Because they want us to get this woman to testify, get her into court, get her to say what she had to say, get her to not to let him back into the house. And we say, well, that's not my job. Well, what is your job, pray tell, they say to us. And we want to say, well, it's to get you to do your job. That's what we are thinking. But instead we say, our job is to support her to reach the goals and the kind of help that she wants, to get her that help and to help her overcome the barriers to getting to where she wants to go. That's our job. It's not to get her to cooperate with the criminal justice system or the family court system or the juvenile court system. Our job is to help her achieve the goals that she wants. The violence that brings us here today is simply all the ways that men who have lost their way have used our bodies, have abused our bodies, the kicking, the slapping, the rapes, the hair pulling, the humiliation of us. Every blow that he throws that puts us on our knees dehumanizes him. He is as dehumanized as we are by his violence. And we are here to stop his violence, both to humanize ourselves and to reclaim our humanity and to humanize him. So whether we're from Springfield, St. Louis, Jefferson City, Macon, Joplin, no matter where we are in the state, we're here together. We're here doing the same thing. We're asking two questions. What is it that causes this violence? And what do we as a social movement and as advocates in that social movement need to do to stop this violence? The word advocate means mouthpiece. It means to take up the stand of another, to speak on behalf of another. Shamita Das-Gupta, one of the founding mothers of Manavi, writes this: the action of advocacy is focused on changing opinions, attitudes, and conducts of individuals or groups in power. Advocates generally act to make something better, instill social justice, and right something they perceive as wrong. Thus, advocacy is usually conducted in favor of individuals or groups whose voices and interests are at risk of being ignored in our society. Socially marginalized ideas as well as concerns of individuals or populations are at the center of all progressive advocacy efforts. If Shamita is right, then we're not just a mouthpiece. We're not just speaking on behalf of another. We're trying to make something happen. We're trying to make something change. The big difference between us advocates and social workers that you might see in a child protection agency or in a mental health agency is that we're trying to change the conditions that women live in that make their lives so difficult. So, for example, a while back I got involved in this case through a research project of a woman who had 9 children. And her 9 children went to 3 different schools. And every morning she had to get 9 kids up, get them dressed, get them washed up, get them fed, get them out the door, get them onto 3 different buses, and get them onto the right buses. And this is where she failed. Oftentimes, one of the little kids would go with one of the middle-aged kids because she just was following her, and she would end up at the wrong school. This got reported to Child Protection. Child Protection came into her life. Child Protection started to look into the way that she was mothering. Now, how does one, on very, very little money, with no support from a partner, isolated from family and friends, mother 9 children? Not very easily. None of us could do this very easily. So as social services involved themselves with her and advocated for her in the sense of providing services for her and support for her, they sent her to a stress reduction class, they sent her to a time management class, and they sent her to a budgeting class. These were the 3 kinds of things that she had to do in order not to be substantiated as a case of child neglect. An advocate would not come in and look at a woman and say, what are the shortcomings that you have in this situation? How are you failing your children? How is it that you're not protecting your children? They would step back and look at what are the conditions in which you are trying to mother? What are your aspirations as a mother, and what's keeping you from getting there? Is it true that she has to send her kids to 3 different schools? Is it going to help her to go to a time management class, or would the time and money be better spent on a time management class, a money class that she had to take and the stress reduction class, if you took all that money and all that time and put it instead into sending somebody over from 7 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning to help her get these 9 kids up, dressed, fed, and on the bus, you would find that that structurally solved her mothering problem. The fundamental difference between an advocate and a social worker who's working with a woman, for example, in the child protection system, is that the social worker is looking at the deficit of the mother. What is it that she lacks? What armor is she missing? What tools is she missing? What skills is she missing to be a good mother? The advocate comes in and says, what are the conditions in which she's trying to do this job? What are her aspirations as a mother, and what is blocking her from being able to do that? And so we're trying to change the conditions. And it's in that difference that we find ourselves often in conflict then with institutional people who want us to hold the hands of women to get them to cooperate with the institution, whether it's the CPS system, whether it's the criminal justice system. We're seen as the people who should take her by the hand and guide her through that system as it stands. And what we do is we take her hand and walk with her and say what's wrong with this system and how it works for her. How many of you have sat in a courtroom and watched someone stand up and told a judge, this is what's going on in this family, whether it's in a child protection case or somebody writing a PSI, Your Honor, in this case, this and this and this is happening, and you think, where did they get this? This is not what's happening in this family. Raise your hand if you've been in a courtroom and you've watched someone, a professional, give a report to the court that had nothing to do with the reality of that woman's life. Okay, raise your hand if you've been in a courtroom where you saw a good judge or a good probation officer or a good prosecutor argue for something that you knew was going to be harmful and you knew that they didn't intend to do that harm. Raise your hand if you've been in that courtroom. Raise your hand if you've listened to a woman blame herself for years of violence and you are the first person who said to her, this is not your fault. And why are so many of us raising our hands? Why are there so many hands up in this room? It's because one of the basic things that goes wrong between women's lives and the institutions that she's drawn into, either willingly or unwillingly, is the inability of that institution to capture what's going on in her life. The institution has its own way of bringing her in and making her into a case. The advocate's role is to make the institution have to deal with the reality of what's going on with her life. It's what we call truth-making, truth-telling. This is what's happening with her, not this. This is who she is, not this. This is what happened, not this. We are there to make the truth come out, to make what's going on in her life visible to the court, visible to the powers that be that are intervening in her life. And in doing so, we're there to say, if this is really what's happening, then what you're about to do is not going to work. So what does this mean to say that we have to get the woman's story into the legal system or into this family court or to this criminal court or CPS court? It means that I'll give you a very, very kind of simple example of how this was done in one community, and actually in many, many communities now. But, when police go out and they investigate a criminal case, they're looking at giving a report that will tell a prosecutor whether or not on this night this person assaulted this person, who was there, what did they see, do you have witnesses, do you have physical evidence, and that's how the report is written. But that event that happened that night is perhaps the tip of an iceberg, or perhaps it's the worst time he's ever hit her or done anything to her. We don't know when we read this police report. What's the context of what happened here? So that was something that people simply asked police to put in. Put the context in by asking women or victims, whether it's a man or a woman, when you go out on a domestic call, ask the victim 3 simple questions. Do you think this person will seriously injure you or your children? Tell us the time that you were most afraid or most harmed by this person. And tell us the pattern. Is this getting worse? Is it getting better? Does it happen weekly? Does it happen monthly? Now, if you take those 3 questions, open-ended dialogue questions with women, this is the kind of answer you get. Here's an example from a police report of an answer a woman gave. I do think he could seriously injure me. I don't know if he would with the kids, but I know I've seen it in his eyes. I know he could kill me. He said he would. I believe he would. The next question is the time that you were most harmed. The time I was the most harmed was when he choked me one night. He choked me until I passed out, and then he kept trying to wake me up. And as I came to, he kept saying, "Are you all right? Are you all right? My dad almost killed my mother. My God, I'm just like him." I was so afraid of him that night because I thought he couldn't tell the difference between him and his dad. The last thing she answered is, lately it's been getting a lot worse. It used to be every 6 months something like this has happened. Now it seems like it's at least every 2 weeks. Last time it happened was only 4 days ago. So yes, it's getting worse. If you see a police report where you have a misdemeanor assault, but these answers to these risk questions, you've already put the woman's story in a way that it was never in there before. This is what's going on in her life, not just this event. This is one simple example of advocates pushing to get a woman's story into the institutional record. This story now comes up at the bail hearing. It comes up for the charging attorney when they're deciding to charge this misdemeanor, rather light assault. It comes up when the pre-SI writer is writing a pre-sentence investigation to the judge. In all these places, all of a sudden, this small event turns into a much bigger thing because that's what's actually going on in a woman's life. Now, how do we do that? Through institutions in many, many ways. I wanted to read to you just a little bit of a psychological report that a psychologist wrote. It's just the beginning, the lead-in to a thing that he's writing about a woman who's facing losing custody to her batterer. And the psychologist begins the report like this. This is a fragile woman who needs to feel connected. Her dependency extends from her husband to her child. She almost fights being independent. And then this report goes on with more and more and more of this kind of garp, what I think of as garp. Now, how is it that a psychologist can start out by writing a report saying this woman needs to feel connected as if that's negative? Is it that we're supposed to kind of go around in the world and feel independent and not feel connected? What is the socialization of women except to be connected to other people, to give birth, to take a human being out of our body, to give birth, to cut that cord and to feed that baby and to stay with that baby and to touch that baby constantly for months and months and months and to raise that child? What is the negativity of the need to be connected? So as soon as the psychologist gets to say that, she needs to feel connected, and the connection extends from her husband to her child as a negative kind of thing, then we're being measured up against this kind of independent, I don't know if it's kind of one of these, cowboy type people that's running across the plains in a horse, or who it is that we're supposed to be compared to as independent, free-thinking, not connected people. But this starts out right away with her as a woman being defective. How is it that people are allowed to write reports that start out like this and go on and on and on about the likelihood of her infantilizing her children, alienating the men from their lives, from reports and from tests that don't even indicate whether or not these things actually happen. Reports that have nothing to do with actually what's going on between the man and the woman, but are kind of discourse fantasy projections by a psychologist of this woman from some tests they took that don't necessarily match what goes on. There are people that are organizing today, right now, like the people who put those 3 risk questions into police reports, that are saying these kind of reports are unacceptable, setting standards for what you can and can't put before a family court around what constitutes information that a judge needs to hear when making custody decisions. That group, if they're successful in changing what it is that a psychologist or a therapist or a guardian ad litem can put before the court in relationship to domestic violence and custody decisions, will change forever the conditions in which women walk into those courtrooms. Today, it's easier for a batterer to get extended custody or to get sole custody of their kids than it is for a non-batterer. So the reason that is because they're able to go into a courtroom that has not thought through how domestic violence impacts the ability of people to parent children and is accountable to the children and the mothers who are the victims of domestic violence when making these decisions. The advocacy group that's being organized by the Battered Women's Justice Project today and many other people in the battered women's movement will change that, and we will see something radically different in 10 years because of their work. That's what advocacy is. It's being a mouthpiece, but it's changing the social conditions that women are trying to survive in. But in many situations, even if we do close the gap between what's going on and what the court knows or what people in the system know about this family, it doesn't necessarily make a difference because what's going on with her doesn't make a difference. Unless we can say that this is what's happening and therefore this is how you should intervene differently. It's this second part of our advocacy is saying that because this is the reality, this, not this, is what the institution should be doing in her life. And that's the whole second kind of push and struggle that we have as advocates. I worked on a case not too long ago where a young woman she was 21 years old, she had a baby, and she's in the hospital, and she overheard a nurse saying that child protection had been notified. And so she knew that somehow they were getting child protection to come in and deal with her. She told her boyfriend, and they ran. They got their baby, they ran out of the hospital, they went and got a motel. Now, why was it that child protection was being called on this woman? She didn't know why, but she just knew to run. But when the case kind of unfolded, first of all, he had a record for selling drugs when he was 16, and he was now 23, I believe. But because he had a criminal record in this jurisdiction, when the police go to take kids with child protection, if they go and escort child protection, they use a SWAT team to remove children if any person in this setting has got a criminal record. So because he did, they used a SWAT team. So they broke into her hotel room, got them both down on the ground, handcuffed them behind their backs, grabbed the baby who was laying on the bed, wrapped the baby up with the blanket from the hotel, and went outside the door and handed this baby over to a social worker. Now, why was this baby being taken away? Because there is a law in this state that says if a person has had 2 terminations, parental terminations, the child must be taken away at birth and a full investigation done before returning that child. And the law was very clear that the standards for returning that child should be extremely high. Well, how was it that this young girl had 2 previous terminations of her parental rights? When she was 13, her father got her pregnant, and she decided with her social worker to give the child up for adoption. When she was 16, her uncle got her pregnant, and she again with her social worker decided to give her baby up for adoption. When you work with social services, if you're poor and you do an adoption through social services like that, it's a termination of your parental rights. It's not seen as an independent adoption. So she had the criteria for losing her child, and the police came in with a SWAT team and took that child away. So the fact that the conditions in which she was now becoming a mother were not understood by the institution, and they didn't matter. It just mattered that she had 2 previous terminations, not the conditions under which those terminations occurred. And off goes the SWAT team, off goes this baby, and now a young nursing mother who's got a baby that's only 3 days old is now it took her 6 weeks before she got to see her child. She never had an opportunity to nurse her child. Every one of us in this room have a story like this of an incredible injustice that happened because not only was the truth not out there of what was going on, but then the institutional response to that truth was so off base, was so unrelated to what needed to happen in that family that you couldn't recognize anything that would equal justice in the end, that would equal an appropriate intervention. And this is the work of advocacy, is to make interventions match what actually is happening in a family and match what's actually happening in a woman's life and in her children's life. So how is it that we do this? The first way that we do it is that let's take, for example, women who kill their husbands who have been, or their partners who have been terrorizing them, stalking them, torturing them, raping them. When the United States bombed Baghdad, 70% of Americans agreed with that bombing. They agreed that because of 9/11, because those buildings went down, because all those people were killed, because that plane went down, because the Pentagon was attacked, that we had to retaliate. And we had to retaliate strongly. Now, why we retaliated against Iraq is still a mystery to many of us. There was a connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. They both have a Q in their names. But other than that, there is no connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. So even though the United States bombed the wrong country, attacked the wrong people, most Americans supported their action, felt that it was fair, felt that it was necessary. And yet, when a woman does the same thing, when she is terrorized, when she is attacked, when she is raped, when her child is attacked, when she is threatened every day with death, when she lives with the enormous amount of fear that we all felt those days after those buildings came down, when she attacks back, and remember, 99.9% of the time, these women get the right guy. When she shoots him, when she kills him, she spends 15 to 25 years in prison. What is the justice in doing that? Why is it that in Texas, if somebody comes onto a person's property and they're not invited and they're not necessarily wanted, that they may end up dead and the shooter is not going to go to jail? Why is it that we don't have a law like this in the United States, that if you rape a person, if you terrorize them, if you beat them, if you beat their children, if you keep them in fear year after year after year, you might get shot and the shooter might not go to jail? Why do we not have such a law here? Is this a failure of advocacy? Because we have to be able to articulate that if you do these kind of things to people, they are going to pick up a weapon and they're going to shoot, because there's no way for them to get safe. We don't have a way for them to get safe. So why are they spending 25 years in prison? Can they spend 2 years in prison? Can they spend 1 year in prison? But do they need to spend 25 years in prison for doing what most of us under those same conditions would have done, and what we as a nation did? Again, as advocates, we are a mouthpiece. We are trying to say what's going on. We're trying to say the disconnect between what happens in women's lives and what institutions do to protect us. One of the biggest things that we can say is that 92% of the times that a man walks into a dorm room and rapes a woman, that he walks into his wife's bedroom and rapes her, that he breaks into his ex-wife's house and rapes her, that he comes from behind a bush and grabs a woman walking down the street and rapes her, 92% of the time he will not be charged with that rape. Every statistic tells us that in the criminal justice system, if you have a conviction rate that's lower than 30 or 35% of people who are doing a crime, you cannot deter that crime. There is no deterrence in this country, no legal deterrence at all to rape. There is some legal deterrence to some kinds of specialized places where rape occurs, but across the board, it is free game for people to be raped. Now, let's just think about, we all watch these TV shows and these very smart cop shows and CSI and things like that, and the bad guys get caught a lot. Now, why is it that you can have a building on a campus that announces a party, puts out a flyer, and you know that every week, or that every other week for a month, for several months going on, that fraternity is going to have a party, and at least every other time a woman is going to be raped at that party. The fraternity members are going to pick a person before the party even starts, and they're going to figure out who it is that they're going to get drunk, who it is that they're going to slip a drug to, who it is they're going to get in another room. They're going to get her in that other room, and 4 or 5 men are going to have what they want from her. And she is supposedly not suffering. They are supposedly not rapists. Now, how is it that the county attorney, the university, the police department cannot figure out how to stop that kind of rape? That wouldn't be true on TV, would it? No. And what is it that we as advocates have done? We've accepted some lame kind of excuse of why it is that we can't stop these rapes. Why is it that we can't plant people in those fraternities? Why is it that we can't catch people who are announcing the date of a crime, who are telling you who's going to be there. We know the players, we know their names, we know everything that there is to really know about them, and yet we cannot stop them from these rapes. It's more likely that a woman who registers her first day to go to a university in this country, that she will be raped than she will get a graduate degree. Now that's a failure of advocacy, it's a failure of law, it's a failure of justice. And we cannot remain so silent about these kinds of rapes and the complicity of attorneys' offices and universities and police departments in maintaining the status quo on these campuses. So I want to shift a minute here to talking about the skills of advocacy. I was trying to paint kind of a bigger picture that there's two main things that we're doing in advocacy. We're trying to say what happens in women's lives and make that real and make it transparent, and we're trying to match the institutional response to that reality. Now, there's 6 basic things that advocates do as advocates. So there are main activities, our core activities of work. And the first one is to connect with women. The second is to fully understand what's going on in her life or the group of women she represents. The third is to analyze with her or with a group what is going on in her life and pick a course of action that she thinks will work for her or the group thinks will work for them. The third is to strategize together. This is the course of action we're going to do. How are we going to do it? The fifth is to implement that course of action, to actually stick with her as she does the course of action, as she moves through things. And the sixth is to reflect then. So these are the skills that we need, and these are the activities that we engage in. And I want to spend a few minutes now talking about each one, but also kind of get us to recommit ourselves to develop these skills, to go as deep as we can in these 6 areas of our work. And I want to start out by talking about connecting. When we connect as an organization, I could say to you, out of 100 women in your community who are being battered or who are being sexually abused or trafficked, which of those are you getting to, and which ones aren't you? Are you getting to the women who are living in the migrant camps? Are you getting to the women who are out on the reservation? Are you getting to the women in all the neighborhoods? Are you getting to the women in the mining camps? Which women are you connecting with, and which women aren't? And so it's those women that we aren't connecting to that we have to say, how is it that we've got a strong connection to women in the neighborhoods in town, but we don't have a connection to women who are living in the migrant camp? How is it that we have a strong connection here but not here? So the first challenge for us is connecting to all the groups of women in our community that are being abused, which means that we need relationships with people in those communities, women in those communities that can help define what it is and how it is that women need help, and then to be a part of delivering that help. So the idea of connecting has another piece to it too, that we've lost in many ways in our work, the art of dialogue. There's many, many things that makes us lose this ability to sit down with a woman and to talk to her, to connect with her, woman to woman. When we first started all this work years ago, and us old people are always saying, back in the old days, we used to do this, like we're some kind of heroes. We didn't know what the hell we were doing back in the old days. But now, one of the things that we do have that we didn't have back in the old days is there was never an intake form between, if a woman came into the shelter at night, I sat down, talked with her, got her whole story, helped her get in bed, helped her kids get in bed. We sat around the dining room table. If there were any women up, we talked together. And by the early morning hours, I knew her story. Now she comes in and I go through an intake with her, and I know the story that we're trying to get. A very particular story that first speaks to our funders, second speaks to the services that we offer, and third gives us an inclination of what's going on with her. But in the old method, you mostly got her story, and then you fit it into these other things. And so one of the first things that is a disconnect between us and women is the way that we literally meet the women and start talking to them. I remember one day a woman called my office, and she had been at the shelter, or she was at the shelter or something like that. And she called me up and she said, I think my husband is going to run with my children. And I said, what makes you think so? And she said that he's been threatening this, he's doing this and this and this. And then I knew the 7 basic questions that you asked to find out how likely it is that someone's going to run. So I started asking her, does he have a job here? Is it a good job? Does he have family? Is he close to his family? Does he have, any ties to a church or any kind of social things like softball or things like that. And she answered all these questions pretty much positively. And I said, the chances of him running are very, very slim. And she, and I, said a few more things to her, hung up and went back to my work. And about 2 weeks later, I was over at the shelter, and there was a women's group there, and I was talking at the women's group, and this woman said, I called over your office, and I got a real asshole on the phone. I said, oh, really? And she said, yeah. And then she said, I called up, and this woman I was talking to, I was telling her how afraid I was that my husband was going to run with the kids, and she said, well, does he have a job there? Does he close to his mother? Does he like his father? Does he this? Does he that? And she asked me these stupid questions that had nothing to do with him, really. I mean, they all made him look real good, but it had nothing to do with if he was going to run with my kids or not. And she was a jerk. And I just didn't know how to say to her, that was me. I said, I will look into that. And I couldn't quite come to tell her it was me that did it. But when I listened to her talk about how stupid I sounded, not engaging with her more about why she thought he was going to leave, but instead statistically looked at what the likelihood was of him leaving and then telling her, don't worry, he's not going to leave. This is what we refer to as using women as data points, where we have information in our heads about battering, about whatever kinds of things we want to say, and then we ask her questions, and then we fill her into this discourse that we have, and then we make a decision about her life and about what's real and what isn't real. It could have nothing to do with what's real. You see all these people now who are doing risk assessments, and it's the same thing they're doing. They think that this is connecting to women, asking them the 7 big questions. Has he ever killed a pet? Has he ever strangled you? Has he ever done this? Has he ever done that? Well, you're a 9 on the risk thing. Well, you haven't really sat down and talked through with this woman how risky is her situation. What makes her think it's risky? What's gone on? Instead, we take the data from a statistical analysis and we apply that to her. We use her as a data point, and we decide she's a 7 or an 8 or a 9. I just give a little story about this. One of the things that people oftentimes look for and weigh when doing risk assessments is whether or not an abuser has killed a pet. So there are 2 women that work with the organization that I work with whose husbands both killed their dogs. And the first woman, her husband, they lived in a trailer park, and her husband bought a dog for the kids for Christmas. And they lived in a trailer park that didn't allow dogs. So he's got the dogs, tied up out in the backyard Christmas evening, and they're all just finishing dinner. And the kids are all excited to go out and play with the dog. And the woman said, you have to get rid of that dog. We cannot keep that dog here. We're going to get kicked out of the trailer house. You're not going out and playing with the dogs, kids. And she said, Tim, you are getting rid of that dog now. So Tim went out there and shot the dog. And the kids are crying and crying and crying. And he said that this is what your mom wanted. Your mom didn't want you to have the dog. I'm sorry. This is not what I wanted to do. I'm sorry. And when she talked about this and told this story, and I said, did that make you, what message was he sending? She said, he wasn't sending a message that he was going to kill me. That wasn't the message. The message was, I can make those kids hate you. And he did it relentlessly. He tried to separate me from my children. And this was one of the primary kinds of things and ways that he would do that. The other woman in our office we were talking about this whole thing of killing pets one night. She said that she came home from work one night, and he insisted that she go out into the garage and clean it. And she said she didn't want to, and he started yelling at her, so she just walked out the door and went out into the garage. And her dog was hanging from, slit wide open and hanging from the rafters in that garage. And she knew right then that he had figured out that her going back to school and the things that she was doing is that she was getting ready to leave him. And that he had figured it out, and he was saying to her, if you leave me, I will kill you. And so here's 2 the same event, 2 batterers killing a dog with extremely different meanings and different kinds of risks to the women. And so the point I want to make here about connecting and the corresponding notion of understanding is that you cannot connect to women that you don't talk to. that you've put 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 barriers in between you and her that keeps you from really connecting to her as another woman. Whether that barrier is your inability to understand her because she's from a different race or a different culture, whether it's a bias that you have about her because she is from a different race or a different culture, whether that barrier is because she's a lesbian and you're not, whether the barrier is because she's disabled and you don't have any knowledge about working with disabled people. Whatever that barrier is that's between you and her, that's the challenge of every advocate, is to break those barriers down, because connecting requires 2 women sitting together and making that connection as women, because the violence that she's experienced is not against her as an individual, it's against her as a woman. And that's where our commonality is, and that's where our common vulnerabilities, and that's where our common action should be from, is that we're standing up to this as women who are vulnerable to the tyranny of this violence in our lives, from womb to tomb. All of us face the possibility of this kind of violence. And so the very first thing I want to say about connecting is breaking down those barriers and breaking down anything that's between you and her, between you and her as an individual, or groups of women that we're not connecting to. So I've talked a little bit about connecting and understanding. I want to say a few more things about understanding as I move into what it means to analyze with a woman. A few years back, I got diagnosed with cancer, and when you hear those words the first time, and you hear that your cancer is not, it's not good, that they start giving you periods of time that you have to live. It's all I can say is it's a shocker. It's a shocker on so many levels to your life. And I went into the doctor one time about maybe 2 or 3 months into this whole ordeal, and I said to him, that I'm just angry. I mean, there's just something wrong with me. I just feel so impatient with people. And you know how that little kid in that movie saw dead people all the time? Well, I was seeing stupid people everywhere. And I was saying to him, I see stupid people. Like, people will sit around at work and talk about who we're going to hire to do this task or that task. And there's 8 people who could easily do it. And I think, why are we sitting around talking about this stupid stuff? And then I'll say, why are we talking about this stupid stuff? We're wasting money. And I was constantly insulting people by telling them that what they had to say was stupid. So he said, he says, it sounds like you might be depressed. And I said, well, there, you see, doctor, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm telling you that I see stupid people, and you tell me I'm depressed. That's not what's going on. And he said, well, I see a little bit of your problem. And so I go in to get my drip, and he sends this young woman in to do a depression test with me. And she's got this little depression test that has, I think it had 9 questions on it, and each question had 4 points. And she said, Dr. Hurley thought that you might want to have this depression test taken. And I said, no, I don't, but if you want to give me one, you can. And she was a student, and it was her last test that she had to get before she got her social work degree. So she starts out with this thing saying, I was supposed to compare what's going on now in my life to 6 months ago. Do you find yourself more angry or crying more? And I was supposed to say on a scale of 1 to 4. And I said, well, I guess I would say 4. I'm crying and angry a lot more than I was, 6 months ago. Do you find that you're using your time differently? And I said, I'd give that a 4 too, because I didn't ever used to come over here to the hospital and get poison dripped in me and then kind of hang around my toilet for the next 3 days. That was not one of the things I spent my time on. So that I'd give a 4. Then she said, is your sleep the same? I said, no, I wake up every single morning at 3 a.m. and I stay awake from 3 a.m. to 5 in the morning doing God only knows what. I'm probably afraid, but I don't feel afraid. I just think about whatever, but I'm always awake between 3 and 5 every morning, so I'd give that a 4. And then she says, do you think about death more now? And I said, well, I do think about death every morning from 3 to 5 in the morning, so how am I doing? She said, you're clinically depressed, you're 16. And I said, I'm 16 with the first 4 questions. She said, yeah. And I said, that test isn't really very good, because if you give that test to anybody in my situation that has cancer, who's recently been diagnosed, is trying to deal with everything that it means, who's trying to deal with the notion of death, then you're going to get a 16, and I don't know that you're getting depression. And she kind of agreed but didn't know what to do. And I said, well, come up with a new test, a test that's looking at other things for people with cancer, but not necessarily predetermining that I have depression, because this test is just automatically going to show me as depressed. And this is the same thing that we do all of the time. When we start talking to women, we ask these kind of pre-formulated questions that just has a natural conclusion to them instead of having real dialogue with them. And because of that, we move into analyzing her situation as if she's depressed, and that might not be the situation, as I don't think it ever was with me. So understanding means you have to have dialogue. You have to understand more than what advocates really want to understand, because we have this thing, safety, 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 safety. That's not her mantra. Her mantra is survival, survival, survival. And it's not necessarily safety. Not every woman would say the biggest concern of hers is getting hit next week. She might want this, she might not want a no contact order for many reasons, knowing she's going to get hit again, but realizing that getting hit again is not as bad as losing her car, losing the person who's taking care of her kids, and losing half the money that comes into the household. So for her, getting hit again, which we're going to say this is a safety issue that prioritizes everything, is not her priority. It's getting through. Yes, she knows she has to deal with the violence in her life. Yes, she knows she's got a husband that's not doing well. Yes, she knows that she probably needs to leave him at some point. But to say that I'm going to leave him right now because he got arrested last night and I don't want him back in the house, that's not where women are at, but that's where advocates are often at. And we push for no contact orders. We don't help a woman stand up and fight against a no contact order because we want to prioritize safety. But she's looking at a much more complex situation. She's looking at his family, her family. If he's in a gang, she's looking at so many more complex things that we don't even ask about. So one of the things about understanding is to take that totality of circumstances going in her life, ask about it all before we move into analyzing what options she has. So let's say we're going to analyze now. We're going to move in and analyze whether or not she should get a protection order. But we haven't done a good enough job of understanding all the pressures that she's facing. We start pushing a protection order that we don't even realize has implications for her that are probably quite negative. So the first three skills of an advocate is to connect with her, to fully understand her circumstances, and then to move into analyzing what should happen. I want to give a little example about analysis because I want to say that we don't just work with individual women, we oftentimes work with women as a group. And I'll kind of connect all of these things up. A woman came into my office today, and she was one day, and she was mad because she had gotten arrested. And she had, this guy had been beating her for years. And then when the police were taking him out of the house, she kicked him in the ass when he had been handcuffed. And she just kind of got away from this officer and went and kicked him and said, that you deserve this, you asshole. And they cuffed her, and off she went. And it was an assault. And she said, he deserved that. I didn't deserve to be arrested. I didn't deserve to have the same thing happen to me that he had to him. And, this mandatory arrest law that you guys have promoted is stupid because, look, they arrested both of us. And she wanted me to do something about it. I said, I didn't get arrested. You did, but I can help you do something about it. And she said, like what? And I said, I think you're not the first person that this has happened to. And this is kind of early on in the mandatory arrest law in the community that I was living in. So I said, I know other women who have been arrested. I will call all of them and try to get them to come here. So we set up a meeting for the following Wednesday or something like that. And I called all the women I knew who had been arrested, said, do you want to come and talk about this? And most of them came. They mostly showed up. And we sat around and we talked about what does it mean that we were arrested? And each woman told her story. And we ended up deciding that we had 3 different groups. We had women who were arrested who were actually acting in self-defense. Technically, it was self-defense, and legally, it was self-defense. Women who were arrested who were retaliating, but their violence was so minimal compared to his that it was like mosquito violence. And then women who had kind of gone off on him and really probably were the overbearing, dominant aggressor in that event. Not necessarily in their whole relationship, but that night they were the ones that kind of went off. And we put ourselves into the group put themselves into those 3 categories, and we said, we need to get up with the police chief and have 3 different responses, one for this, and one for this. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about what would that meeting with the police be like, how do we do it, practicing telling our stories, practicing answering questions that he might ask, practicing him maybe insulting us. And then we said, okay, let's get him in here. That was, we analyzed what was going on. Then we strategized. Let's get him in here. Let's tell our stories, but let's have some kind of a recommendation of where we want to go. So we called around, talked to some other people, and realized there was this thing called a predominant aggressor, where a policy would actually discourage police from arresting both parties and say, just arrest the predominant aggressor. So we wrote up what we thought the criteria of predominant aggressor should be, got the police chief in and said, we think that when we're acting in self-defense, your cops don't necessarily know it. We think you should train them better on self-defense. We think that when we also use violence, you should determine if one person was way more aggressive than the other over time. And thirdly, if we're using the predominant violence, then we think we should be arrested. So that was our kind of pitch to the police chief. He talked to us for a long time. There was a lot of bantering back and forth. The women practiced and practiced before that meeting, and they did a great job. And the police chief agreed that he would adopt a new policy and he would initiate this training. This is a perfect example of working with women as a group to first connecting them. That was my first job, was to connect them. Then to get an understanding as they told their stories with each other, analyze what we had as options, calling up some other people, strategizing what we would do when the police chief came in. And then when he came in, we said, we'd like to be in on the training. And he said, are you going to be nice? We promised we would be nice. And we did a really, really good job of helping a prosecutor and a police officer train the officers on this. So those are the skills: connecting, understanding, analyzing, strategizing, implementing, and then finally reflecting with those women, saying, what's next? We have to make sure, we have to monitor this and make sure that they actually do what we did. And so we set up a monitoring system, and that came out of our reflection process. So all 6 of these are skills, they're activities, and they're ways of working with women where we work in partnership with each other. We're not doing for them, we're doing with them. And that's exactly the roots of our advocacy notion, was that we were standing with women as women to change the conditions of our lives collectively. So here I am on page 7 of a 12-page talk, and I'm out of time. So I guess I want to just wrap up by going to page 12, in which I wanted to end by talking a little bit about this notion of justice. I think many people might remember that when the apartheid ended in South Africa, there was a huge question about what's going to happen. Is there going to be just bloodshed? How is any sense of justice going to be restored to this country where the oppression has been so severe, the violence so long-standing, so deep in that country? And Archbishop Desmond Tutu is one of the great leaders of our time, who kept demanding that what we seek here is justice, not revenge. And he always said that justice contained 3 things. It absolutely required that the truth be told. Who did what to who when? So how is the truth told when 92% of men who rape women are never charged? If they don't get convicted, that's one thing. But if they're charged and their name is out there and the state says, we believe that you did this crime, that's another thing. That's telling the truth. But to take a long-standing policy of not charging unless there's an absolute conviction says that we're not going to tell the truth. We're not going to let the truth out. And so 98% of men who rape women are not even going to be called into court and charged with that crime. So how is it that we start thinking of the truth being told, that what happened to women gets out there? That tiny little thing of the 3 risk questions, and all of a sudden you go into arraignment court and somebody is reading off the answers to her 3 risk questions, puts into court something other than a bail evaluator's number. Your Honor, we give this a number 7, recommend ROR. Your Honor, this is the violence that we understand is occurring in this household, and this is the violence that occurred that evening. That's truth-telling. So that's a big change that we want to make. We want the violence to be out there. We want it to be told. We want what happens to be visible. Secondly, Desmond Tutu says that we have to whatever extent possible, heal people who have been damaged, people who have been harmed. And so what does it mean to heal? Does it mean to heal that why is it that most women who get raped on campuses do not complete their studies, but the rapist often does? They're far more likely to complete their studies and get their degree than the raped woman is. How is that healing? How is that contributing to healing? That is a statistic that has to be flip-flopped. I don't care if he gets his degree or not personally, but the question is that why is she the one that leaves campus? Why is she the one that can't sleep at night? Why is she the one that is going to suffer for years and years and years for an act of inhumanity that he did? And so when we think about what it means to heal, it doesn't simply mean that we just process her through so many steps of a legal process and then send her on her way. It means we stay connected with her for the period of time that it takes for her to heal, and that we invite her into our work and invite her into doing the kinds of things we do to help. For many, many women, joining this movement was what helped them heal. We have more barriers now to joining our movement than we ever did when we started 30 years ago. Finally, Desmond Tutu says that to heal, to achieve justice, we need to change the social conditions that created that injustice. So we can never be satisfied with being a United Way agency and responding to our funding person by saying how many units of service we delivered that month. We have to say how many units of justice we delivered. We have to say what we changed and how we changed it. The balance between what we do as systems advocacy and group advocacy and individual advocacy has gotten way, way out of whack. We are now doing 90% or 95% individual advocacy and only 5 to 10% of institutional and social change advocacy. Until these things are balanced, we are going to be losing ground, not gaining ground. And so if we can hearken back to what Desmond Tutu said, that we tell the truth, that we, to whatever extent possible, heal the damage, and that we change the social conditions that cause this violence in the first place. That is what makes us advocates for justice. And so I want to thank everyone for being here, everyone for listening to me, and to wish you the best for the rest of your conference.